We've heard a little bit from Trump since the events of Saturday about how he's doing, but also about where this takes his campaigning. And he has said that he will use his speech at the RNC to call for unity. I wonder how long you think that will be in Trump's interests to push that kind of message to Republicans.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I don't know how long it will last. I hope it lasts right through Election Day and through his next term. But I think it will last at least for a few months. And look, the Trump campaign has been so much more disciplined, and President Trump himself has been so much more disciplined in this cycle versus 2020 and even versus 2016. So if that's the message that we're getting, which it is from the campaign, from President Trump, then I would expect that they will stick to it. I think the only major change could be if President Biden, reverts back to the mean or reverts back to his sort of angry, what Trump is bad campaign, as opposed to what the President Biden has been saying in the last 24 hours that he wants to, sort of dial down the rhetoric. So I think we're hearing the right things from both candidates. That's a good thing. I think it makes the campaign better if we could focus on issues and outcomes and decision making. I think the Republicans are in good shape.
Where do you think that move to be more disciplined, Greg, comes from the Trump campaign? Because some have suggested that that's been the case, in particular in the last couple of weeks, since President Biden has started to perform so badly in debates, and his poll ratings have reflected that the Republicans have just thought they can sit back and watch what the Democrats are sort of doing to themselves. Would that be your analysis?
I think there's two things. One is, as you point out, that they can do nothing. They can sit back and watch the self-destruction of the Biden campaign. That's Napoleon has always said. Napoleon used to say, never make a mistake. I mean, if your enemy's making a mistake, don't do anything, right? In a sense. And so, but the other thing is, I think that there's just a different group running the campaign. Susie is much more disciplined this time around, or at least has more management and more control over the campaign. So I think that you'll see, that there's really two reasons. One is, as you pointed out, after the debate, it was best just to sit back. The format of the debate was actually favoring President Trump. Even though the format came from the Biden camp and from perhaps President Biden himself, the idea that there was a mute button and it you couldn't interrupt, that actually favored President Trump. It made him look more disciplined and controlled. But that's been the case in the campaign over the last year.
Greg, it's worth putting in context as well that President Trump, as president, as candidate, has lent into kind of violent rhetoric as well, talking about roughing up protesters, talking about retribution, mocking Paul Pelosi after a brutal hammer attack. So that is important context as well. Where does it leave us in terms of fundraising for this Republican Party and the infrastructure around Trump? Where do you see that? How do you see that story evolving?
Yeah, it probably gets better. I would imagine a surge in fundraising after Saturday. Whether that's sustainable or not, I don't know. But you saw the similar surge after any time he goes through some difficulty. You saw a massive surge after the verdict on May 30th. You saw a big surge after the mugshot last summer. So these things typically help President Trump. I think that the fundraising has been very successful. The Democrats have a fundraising advantage in general, and I would have expected a massive fundraising advantage for Biden over President Trump, even after the great Mar-a-Lago or the great Palm Beach fundraiser where Trump raised $50 million. That was kind of a one-off. We had a fundraiser in London for President Trump, raised a few $1 million, which is big for an outside the U.S. is probably the record for an ex-U.S. event. But that's not sustainable compared to what President Biden could be expected. Now, that was all prior to the debate and prior to some of his big donors suggesting that they're going to cut back or even stop. You saw the $90 million number a few days ago. You saw George Clooney, who, I always try to remind people, he's not just a Hollywood celebrity. He's not just a movie star. he is a massive donor and massive fundraiser. He had an event in LA for President Biden a few weeks ago, and raised $30 million. So this is a big change in the campaign. President Biden's numbers are plummeting in terms of fundraising. President Trump's have done very well compared to expectations. And I believe that will continue, especially after Saturday.
What do you say when you sit here in London? You're, of course, in Milwaukee, and we appreciate you taking the time. But when you're in London, what do you say to those with that international concern? We know it's widespread about a Trump presidency, a Trump 2.0,
Sure.
particularly coming from a president who was unwilling to accept the democratic will of the people of the US, tried to overturn an election. How do you respond to that deep-seated international concern?
Yeah, I mean, look, there are some valid concerns. I know the earlier guest was talking about tariffs and trade, and I would hope that President Trump this time around keeps the tariffs focused on trading partners who aren't necessarily playing by the rules, or at least playing fairly, such as China, which is the most obvious, and rather than tariffs on our allies and our traditional trading partners. So I think if he wants free and fair trade, we can get free and fair trade, but let's not overdo it with tariffs, obviously. That's one big risk. But I think a lot of the other risks are overblown. You talked about, first of all, NATO is typically at the top of the conversation in the UK and in Europe. But, look at what's happened lately. You have 23 countries that have reached their 2% of GDP commitment. It was 4 back in 2014. I believe it was 7 or so when President Trump took office in 2017. And so, his rhetoric, while sometimes clumsy, is actually better for NATO in general. And again, I know he overdoes it with the rhetoric occasionally. That's his way of communicating and his way of getting NATO to change. Now, my biggest concern with NATO still is that the big economies, Germany, France, Spain, are not meeting the 2%. Of course, the UK is, they always have, around 2.5%. But the biggest risk, and this is where I think the voters and audience in the UK and Europe do not understand this, is President Biden has cut defense spending 3% in real terms 3 years in a row. That's 9% of U.S. defense spending, again, in real terms. The U.S. is still half of NATO. Now, President Trump, when he was in office, increased military spending, defense spending. He tried to make the military stronger, whether you agree with that or not. But I think in Europe, it should be very important for NATO and Europe in general to have a strong U.S. defense when it's still half of NATO defense spending. So essentially, we've had a 4.5% cut of NATO spending total in 3 years. That should worry the Europeans. So I think they're not used to, still, even after 8 years, Europeans, especially, and also in the UK, are just not comfortable with the way President Trump speaks, but they should be very comfortable with the way he acts and what he's done for defense and what he's done for economic growth. So I think, that as our trading partners, you want a strong U.S. GDP growth. You want strong America in terms of security.
Yep. Greg, final quick question from me. Nikki Haley's going to be speaking. How significant is that? What role do you think she's going to be playing? And after this weekend, the nomination for the vice president feels even more significant. Who do you think it's going to be?
Yeah, tough one on the latter question. It's really the inner circle, the short list changes all the time. You've heard in the last few days a lot of J.D. Vance talk. I don't know that would be my call, because I think he's in the same lane as President Trump. He's got the same appeal to the similar voters, the traditional President Trump base, for sure. And then to your question about Nikki Haley, she's a completely different lane. So I think the fact that she's speaking is great news for the convention. There was concern over the last 6 months in the conservative media in the U.S. specifically that the party wasn't united. You still had that 20% of Nikki Haley voters that were still voting for her in the late primaries. And we were afraid that, we wouldn't get them back into the party, get that party unity. I think with Nikki Haley speaking at the convention, it's really going to help.
Yep.
It might not get 100% of Republicans on board, but if you get back to 90, then that's fantastic. So Ron DeSantis is also joining in. So you have the two major competitors in the nomination process with President Trump speaking at the convention. So that's great news for unity.